Hello everyone and welcome to Family Home Evening. When I was a kid, my family kept all of our scriptures in a small end table in the living room next to the couch. We called it the scripture cabinet. There were always enough books in it for everyone in the family to have their own Book of Mormon, and there was also a little copy of the Gideon's New Testament with Psalms and Proverbs. I'm not sure where it came from, but whenever one of my little siblings who hadn't learned how to read wanted to have scriptures too, it was the perfect size for their little hands. But it made me curious too. It wasn't the full Bible, just the New Testament plus Psalms and Proverbs. I wondered why it included only those books, as if it was skipping the Old Testament, only keeping the nice parts, tossing the rest. Why was that? The Gideons, of course, published the complete Bible as well, but that only made this redacted version even more strange to me. Why would someone want a Bible that excluded the Old Testament? I've noticed that a lot of people are kind of uncomfortable with the Old Testament, or see it as irrelevant since Jesus Christ fulfilled the law of Moses and gave the higher law. But a lot of people do see the God of the Old Testament as different from what we learn about God in the New Testament. In the restored gospel and through the Lord's modern prophets, we know that Jesus Christ was the great Jehovah of the Old Testament as well as the Messiah of the New. But how can this be? In the Old Testament, God outright kills huge numbers of people in Noah's flood, in Sodom and Gomorrah, and in the plagues of Egypt, including killing every firstborn son of the Egyptians. Even more, he commands the Israelites multiple times to kill every man, woman, and child in a number of cities. The Old Testament God seems bloodthirsty, unforgiving, and cruel. How could this be the same God that taught us to turn the other cheek in the New Testament? Did he change his mind? I have 3 thoughts about that. First, God is actually the same. There isn't actually much difference at all between the Old Testament God and the New Testament God. The Old Testament is absolutely packed with verses talking about how kind, loving, patient, and forgiving the Lord is, especially in Psalms, and there are some fantastic ones in Isaiah. Like, a lot of verses. And there are some really good examples in the New Testament that show Jesus hasn't just gone soft. He literally said, "I came not to send peace, but a sword." And remember, Revelation contains some of the bloodiest prophecies in the whole canon, and it's in the New Testament. God didn't just change his mind in between Malachi and Matthew. He is the same yesterday and today and forever. People sometimes tend to be a little bit selective when describing what and how Jesus taught, emphasizing the nice parts while downplaying the consequences for sin. The Old Testament has both, and the New Testament has both. It's mostly a matter of perspective. Which leads to my second point, that it's unfair to compare the Old Testament and the New Testament this way. The Old Testament contains around 4,000 years of history describing numerous different kingdoms and the effects of serving the Lord or rejecting him. The New Testament, on the other hand, covers only a few decades and mostly consists of preaching. Of course, there will be a lot more war and death in the Old Testament. Given that context, it would be extremely bizarre if there wasn't. We also don't have the whole picture of the facts in either book. The Old Testament was written and compiled based largely on oral traditions centuries after the events took place, and the history may easily have been colored by generations of retellings, or even some degree of nationalism playing up the parts where our God can beat up your God. Meanwhile, the New Testament consists almost entirely of letters and brief accounts written specifically to help spread the gospel throughout the world. Of course, they will lean towards the positive aspect of the gospel. They were never meant to be a complete biography of Jesus Christ, or even a full rundown of the gospel. There is so much that we need to rely on living prophets and apostles for. But my final point is that death isn't inherently evil. Most of the complaints about this topic are based on the logic that murder is evil, so if God commands his people to kill other people, then God must be evil. But calling it murder implies that it's unjustified, which is wrong. Every time that God has destroyed a nation, it has been for their wickedness. God is the only judge who can weigh life and death with complete justice and mercy. To claim that God must either be evil or not exist on the basis of him commanding people to kill only means that you disagree that the deaths were justified. In other words, it only means that you believe your judgment is more just than God's. And whether God chooses to execute his righteous judgment by a flood or by an army of people who have covenanted to serve him really should make no difference. And besides, the whole question only works in a limited human frame of reference. The plan of salvation makes it clear that death is not the end, and it is not final judgment. Every single person will have a chance to accept the gospel and inherit all the Father hath, if they choose it. They lose nothing from an eternal perspective by dying. And we can be confident that if God chose that course of action, then it will be the best possible outcome for everyone. It can be hard to explain exactly how that can be in any given case, but His thoughts are not our thoughts, neither are our ways His ways. God is merciful, kind, and forgiving, but He is also just, and sometimes that justice requires harsh consequences. The Old Testament includes so many stories that explain God's complete character, both His mercy and His justice. It's not always the most fun book to read, but I think too many people opt to ignore it altogether. My wife and I have been reading from the Old Testament for our family scripture studies, and we have had some incredible discussions based on it. I think we should give the Old Testament the respect it deserves. Thank you for joining me for Family Night. I hope you enjoyed this video, and if you have any favorite characters or stories from the Old Testament, feel free to tell us about them in the comments. I also won't be posting a video next week. I have a lot going on right now and I need a bit of a break. But hopefully I'll see you guys soon, and as always, thank you for watching, and have a great couple of weeks.